Ciao a tutti! Today we'll be talking about transitive and intransitive verbs. So hold on to your hats, ladies and gents, because it's going to be one bumpy ride. So without further ado, get your pens and paper at the ready and let's get started. Firstly, we need to understand the distinction between direct object and indirect object. A direct object can be a noun, phrase, clause or pronoun and answers the question what or whom. For example, mangio una mela. Una mela here is a direct object simply because it answers the question what. Mangio what? Mangio una mela. An indirect object, on the other hand, answers the question to what or to whom. For example, I gave the book to Joe. I gave the book to whom? I gave it to Joe. Therefore, to Joe is an indirect object since it answers the question to whom. Now that we've got that covered, let's go back to transitive and intransitive. Transitive verb is an action verb. A transitive verb follows the rule of subject plus verb plus object. For example, il voglio una bicicletta. The bicicletta here is clearly a direct object because it answers the question what. I want a bike. And therefore, since it includes a direct object, volere must be a transitive verb. Just when you thought you grasped it well, a direct object can be implicit. For example, I'm reading what? You don't necessarily have to have the direct object there, but you just assume that you're reading some form of object. Thus, reading keeps its transitive function, and the book becomes an implicit direct object. Now on to intransitive verbs. Transitive verbs do not take the direct object, unlike transitive verbs. For example, my dad goes to work every morning. My dad goes to what or whom doesn't make sense. So you naturally ask the question where. My dad goes where? My dad goes to work. This is also the same in French. Je vais au restaurant. Je vais where au restaurant? You ask where, not what. Thus, it is intransitive. In Italian, we use auxiliary verbs, avere or essere, when we use compound tenses. For example, the passato prossimo. But what one do we use when forming the passato prossimo? And how do you decide? Well, that depends on whether it is transitive or intransitive. Transitive verbs take avere. Remember that transitive verbs are those who take the direct object. For example, ho mangiato una pizza. The pizza here is a direct object because it answers the question what. I ate what? I ate a pizza. Therefore making mangiare intransitive, and therefore having to use avere as an auxiliary. This rule applies to French as well. You have to use avoir transitive. For example, j'ai lu un livre. The livre is a direct object, therefore meaning you have to use avoir. So, the compound tense of a transitive verb is formed as following: auxiliary verb, which is avere, plus the past participle. The regular verb endings are as follows when using avere as its auxiliary: are, ato, ere, uto, ire means ito. Intransitive verbs use essere. For example, sono andata al supermercato. You ask the question where, meaning that it's intransitive, and thus you must use essere. Verb endings must agree with the gender and number when using essere with intransitive verbs, as seen here. Moreover, many verbs are not transitive or transitive by nature, but can be either transitive or intransitive depending on the content of the sentence. So, they will take either auxiliaries depending on whether they use intransitive or transitively. When the verbs are transitive, they use the auxiliary avere, and when they are intransitive, they use the auxiliary essere, as expressed by the general rule. The main verbs that follow this rule are finire, cominciare, iniziare, salire, passare, scendere, migliorare, e aumentare. For example, ho finito I compiti asks the question what. I finished what? I finished I compiti, meaning it is transitive because there's a direct object, and therefore we have to use avere as the auxiliary. Another example of finire is il film è finito tardi. You can't ask the question what or who, therefore meaning this is intransitive, and meaning we have to use the auxiliary essere. Remember, you have to ensure that the ending agrees with the gender and noun of the verb. Another example of scendere is Rita ha sceso la scala di corsa. This is transitive because there is a direct object and therefore having to use avere. On the other hand, il gatto è sceso dall'albero. This is intransitive because there is a preposition and meaning you have to use the auxiliary essere. Now we have that done and dusted, I think it's time for a dancing stickman to celebrate.